You think you're smart because you know the right words. And here's the uncomfortable truth. So did I. So did almost everyone who's ever sat in a classroom, read a textbook, or watched the news. We learned the names. We repeated the terms. We passed the tests. And we walked away convinced we understood something. We didn't. And the man who understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived wasn't a philosopher or a psychologist. He was a physicist. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist who grew up in far Rockaway, Queens, who could crack safes, play bongo drums, and explain quantum electrodynamics to a curious stranger on a train. His name was Richard Feynman, and the lesson his father taught him as a small child in the woods of New Jersey may be the most important intellectual lesson any human being can receive. It begins with a bird. The bird with 1,000 names. Young Richard is walking through the woods with his father, Melville Feynman. A bird lands on a branch nearby. Richard points. His father looks. "That's a brown-throated thrush," his father says. Richard nods. He files it away. Brown-throated thrush. Then his father says something the young boy never forgot. Something that would shape the entire arc of one of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century. In Portuguese, his father continues, it's called a Johnny de Canto. In Italian, a pichere. In Chinese, a chongling. You can know the name of that bird in every language in the world. And when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. Stop. Think about that for a moment. Every language in the world, every label, every symbol, every sound humans have attached to that creature sitting on that branch, and at the end of that recitation, nothing. You know nothing about the bird. What does it eat? How does it find a mate? What happens in its lungs when it sings? How does it navigate 1,000 miles of migration by sensing the magnetic field of the Earth? What predators does it fear? What does fear even look like in a creature with a brain the size of a marble? The name tells you none of this. The name is a pointer, a tag, a sticky note attached to reality, and we have been confusing the sticky note for the wall for our entire lives. Feynman called this the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. It sounds simple. It sounds almost too simple to bother saying out loud. But here's the thing, once you really hear it, you start seeing this confusion everywhere. In classrooms, in boardrooms, on television, in your own head. The moment you genuinely absorb what Feynman's father was pointing at, you cannot unsee it. And that is both liberating and, frankly, a little terrifying. The illusion factory. Let's talk about how modern education actually works. Not the ideal version, the actual version. A student encounters a new concept. Let's say it's photosynthesis. The teacher introduces the word photosynthesis. It sounds impressive. It sounds like knowledge. The student learns to spell it. They learn that it involves sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, and that it produces glucose and oxygen. They write this on a test. They get the answer right. They move on. But now ask that student, why does a plant turn toward light? Not what is the name of that process. The name is phototropism, by the way, another impressive word. But why? What is actually happening inside the cells? What problem is the plant solving? What does it mean for a thing with no brain, no nervous system, no eyes, to want light? Most students cannot answer this. Most teachers, if we're being honest, cannot answer this at the level Feynman would have demanded. And yet we have created an entire civilization of credentialed experts who can produce the correct vocabulary on command and who have been awarded the social badge of understanding as a result. This is what Feynman called cargo cult science. He borrowed the image from a phenomenon that occurred in the Pacific during World War II, where indigenous islanders watched American military planes land and deliver extraordinary supplies, food, medicine, tools. After the war ended and the planes stopped coming, some islanders built mock runways. They fashioned wooden headphones. They lit fires along the landing strips. They performed all the rituals they had observed. They did everything right, superficially. Except the planes didn't come, because they had the form of the practice without the substance. Now ask yourself, where in your own life have you built wooden headphones? Where have you mastered the vocabulary of a subject while remaining genuinely ignorant of its actual mechanics? The economics test. Here's a thought experiment. Let's say you're at a dinner party and someone mentions inflation. You nod along. You know the word. You might even say something like, "It's when prices go up." Or if you're feeling sophisticated, "It's a decrease in the purchasing power of currency." People around the table nod. You feel like you've demonstrated understanding. But here's Feynman's test. Can you explain the mechanism? Not the name for what happens, but how it actually works. Why does more money in circulation cause prices to rise? What are the actual causal steps? And while you're at it, does more money always cause inflation? What about during a recession? What happened in Japan in the 1990s when they flooded their economy with money and almost nothing happened? What about the difference between demand pull inflation and cost push inflation? And more importantly, can you explain those without using those phrases? If you find yourself reaching for more terminology to explain terminology, you have found your wooden headphones. This is not an attack. This is not meant to make you feel foolish. Feynman was not cruel in his diagnosis. He was compassionate. He made this point not to embarrass people, but to liberate them. Because here is the beautiful thing he understood. Real understanding is available to everyone. The universe does not require you to have a PhD. It requires you to actually look, to actually ask, to actually refuse the comfort of the label. The doctor who knows the name. Let's go deeper. Let's try medicine, because this one matters. Someone goes to their doctor with fatigue, brain fog, and joint pain. After some tests, the doctor says, "You have fibromyalgia." The patient goes home, Googles fibromyalgia, reads the Wikipedia article, tells their friends they have fibromyalgia, joins a fibromyalgia support group. They now feel they understand what is wrong with them. Except, and here is the part that should make you sit up. Fibromyalgia is essentially a name for the symptoms the patient reported. The mechanism is not understood. The cause is disputed. The diagnostic criteria have changed multiple times. What the doctor actually said, translated into Feynman's language, is this: you have fatigue, brain fog, and joint pain. We are calling this fibromyalgia, and we are not sure why it's happening. Now, is that the doctor's fault? Often no. Medicine is genuinely incomplete. There are enormous territories of human biology we do not understand. But the problem arises when the name becomes a destination rather than a starting point, when the label ends the inquiry rather than beginning it. The name should make us more curious, not less. This is the difference Feynman's father was drawing. Not that names are useless. The brown-throated thrush needs a name so we can talk about it, communicate about it, look it up, share our observations. Names are the scaffolding of communication. But scaffolding is not the building. The scaffolding is how you build the building. At some point, you have to actually put up walls. The 3 questions that expose everything here is a diagnostic tool, a simple framework derived from the spirit of Feynman's thinking, something you can apply to any subject, any claim, any moment when you want to know whether you're looking at real understanding or a very convincing impersonation of it. The first question: can you explain it without using the technical term? If you understand something, you can translate it. If someone who had never heard the word inflation asked you what was happening to the price of bread at the grocery store, could you walk them through the mechanics using only plain words, images, analogies? If the technical vocabulary is not a shortcut for a concept you already hold, if it is the concept, the only way you can access it at all, then you don't have the concept yet. You have the label. They are not the same thing. Feynman himself was famous for doing this. He was once asked to explain why magnets repel each other. He spent several minutes exploring the question from multiple angles, acknowledging its genuine difficulty, and ultimately revealed something most physics teachers never say out loud. The answer involves quantum electrodynamics, and any intuitive explanation he gives will require you to accept some analogies that eventually break down. He didn't pretend. He didn't reach for a word that would make the questioner feel satisfied. He stayed in the discomfort of genuine inquiry. The second question: can you predict what will happen next? Understanding is not just the ability to describe what happened. It is the ability to anticipate. A mechanic who truly understands an engine doesn't just know the names of the parts. They can listen to a sound and tell you which part is stressed and what will fail next and why. A climatologist who truly understands the carbon cycle doesn't just recite the names of greenhouse gases. They can model the implications of a 1-degree shift in ocean temperature and trace the downstream consequences through precipitation patterns and agricultural yields. Prediction is the acid test. It's easy to name something after it happens. It's entirely different to understand it well enough to see around corners. The third question: where does your explanation break down? This is perhaps the most important and the most neglected. Every model, every analogy, every mental framework has edges, places where the map stops corresponding to the territory. The person who truly understands a subject knows where their understanding ends. They can tell you the confidence interval. They can say, my model works here, and it starts to fail here, and beyond this point I genuinely don't know. The person who only knows the name cannot do this. They have the name for everything and the limits of nothing. They will apply their label with equal confidence at the center of their expertise and at its outermost edge, and they will not know the difference because they were never inside the understanding to begin with. But here's where it gets interesting. The person who knows the limits of their understanding is actually more trustworthy, not less. Feynman's famous statement about quantum mechanics was that if you think you understand it, you don't understand it. This was not false modesty. This was the signal of genuine depth. Real experts are more uncertain, not less. They have been deep enough into the subject to see how strange it gets, how counterintuitive, how resistant to clean summary. Confidence without acknowledged limits is almost always a sign that someone has not gone very far. The media machine and the name game. Let's apply this to something you encounter every day: the news. Turn on any major news network, any talk radio program, any political podcast, and count how many times an explanation is given versus how many times a name is deployed. You will hear about systemic racism or critical race theory. You will hear about the deep state or neoliberalism. You will hear about supply chain disruptions and algorithmic bias and quantum supremacy and herd immunity. Each of these terms contains real, substantive, intellectual content. Each of them corresponds to genuine phenomena worth understanding. But in most media contexts, they are not being used to transmit that understanding. They are being used as signals, identity markers. Tribal vocabulary. Saying systemic racism in one crowd and reverse discrimination in another is not a difference in understanding. It is often a difference in which name you have been taught to use for a similarly fuzzy mental model. The same person might use both terms correctly in their respective social environments without ever developing a genuine mechanistic understanding of how institutions perpetuate inequality, whether intentionally or not, through feedback loops in hiring, housing, lending, and law enforcement. The names do the work of sounding informed while the understanding remains absent. And here is where it becomes genuinely dangerous, because when you mistake the name for the understanding, you lose the ability to update. If you actually understand something, new evidence can change your view. You can follow the mechanism to where the new data points and revise your model. But if you only have the name becomes identity. Changing your view would require admitting you never really understood it in the first place. So instead, the brain defends the name. This is how intelligent, educated people end up in epistemic prisons of their own vocabulary. The Feynman Technique and the way out. The good news, and Feynman was always, ultimately, in the business of good news about the universe, is that the door out of this prison is always open. It requires discomfort and honesty, but it is never locked. Feynman developed what is now widely called the Feynman Technique, though he never gave it that name himself. It has 4 steps, and each one is a direct application of what his father taught him in the woods. Step 1. Take a blank piece of paper. Write at the top the name of the concept you want to understand. Then explain it in writing as if you were teaching it to a child, not a graduate student. A child. No jargon, no technical shorthand. If you cannot do this, and you will discover very quickly if you cannot, you have found the edge of your actual understanding. Step 2. Look at where your explanation broke down. Where did you reach for a term instead of a mechanism? Where did you get vague? Where did you wave your hand? Those are the locations of borrowed knowledge, of sticky notes on walls, of names without understanding. Go back to the source material, not to memorize new terms, to actually understand the mechanism. Step 3. Simplify again. Try to make your explanation even more elementary. Use an analogy. Find a visual image. Tell a story that encodes the principle. This is not dumbing down. This is the deepest form of intelligence. Einstein reportedly said that if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. The same principle, the same root. Step 4. Review and refine. Test your explanation on an actual human being who knows nothing about the subject. Watch their face. When they look confused, that is information about your understanding, not information about their intelligence. The confusion is yours. Find it. Fix it. What this technique actually does is force the collision between the name and the understanding. It closes the gap your brain has been papering over with vocabulary. It is uncomfortable. It reveals ignorance you didn't know you were carrying. And it is one of the most useful intellectual tools ever discovered. The child who keeps asking, why there's another dimension to what Feynman's father gave him, and it might be the most profound one. The father did not answer the question of what the bird was called and move on. He used the bird as a doorway. He invited his son to keep going, to keep asking, to understand that the name was a beginning, not an ending. Think about what children do naturally before the educational system trains it out of them. They ask why. Why is the sky blue? Because light scatters. Why does light scatter? Because of the way photons interact with molecules in the atmosphere. Why do photons interact that way? And here, the child is now closer to genuine physics than most adults who can name all the phenomena in question. We call this annoying. We tell children to stop. We are, in this moment, training them to accept names as destinations. We are building the walls of the prison they will spend their adult lives inside, mistaking for the whole world. Feynman never stopped asking why. His entire career was a refusal to accept that a name constituted an explanation. When he encountered a phenomenon that everyone knew the explanation for, he would go back and ask whether anyone had actually demonstrated the mechanism, or whether the field had simply agreed to name the mystery and proceed. Remarkable often he found that the name had been doing the work of understanding for years, sometimes decades, and that when someone actually went looking for the mechanism, it was not where everyone assumed it was. The history of science is full of these moments. Stomach ulcers were thought to be caused by stress. Everyone knew this. The name stress ulcer said it all, until Barry Marshall and Robin Warren asked whether anyone had actually looked and discovered the bacterium Helicobacter pylori in the stomach lining. They had to fight the medical establishment for over a decade because the name was so firmly in place that the mechanism had stopped being questioned. The name had become the understanding, and the actual mechanism had been hiding in plain sight for years. What real expertise sounds like. There is a sound that genuine understanding makes, and once you learn to hear it, you cannot mistake it for anything else. It sounds uncertain in the right places. It sounds specific about where the evidence is strong and where it thins out. It sounds willing to say, I don't know, not as an evasion but as a precise description of the actual state of knowledge. It uses technical language not to impress, but to compress, as a shorthand for concepts already explained in plain terms, returned to only after the foundation has been laid. Feynman had this quality to an almost theatrical degree. His lectures are full of moments where he stops, frowns, says, now wait, let me think about this differently, not because he doesn't know the material, but because he is genuinely present in the act of understanding, not performing a recitation of what he already knows. He is thinking in front of you. He is showing you what thinking looks like when it is not dressed up in the costume of certainty. Compare this to the pundit on television who speaks with absolute authority about a complex economic system, who deploys a stream of technical vocabulary without ever pausing to show you the mechanism, who never says, I don't know, or this is where my model gets complicated. This is not a sign of expertise. It is a sign that names are doing the work that understanding should be doing. And if you watch carefully, you will notice that the more uncertain the pundit is at the level of mechanism, the more certain they tend to sound at the level of conclusion. The vocabulary inflates to fill the space where evidence should be. The names multiply to conceal the absence of understanding, the gift of honest ignorance. Here is perhaps the most counterintuitive point in all of this, and the one that Feynman lived most fully. Knowing that you don't understand something is enormously more valuable than falsely believing you do. This sounds obvious when stated plainly. Of course, it's better to know what you don't know, but the emotional reality is different. Not knowing is uncomfortable. It is socially expensive. It makes you look uncertain in a world that rewards the performance of certainty. It opens you to being wrong, being questioned, being exposed. But here is what the honest ignorance gives you: the ability to actually learn. The false certainty provided by a well-memorized name closes the door on inquiry. If you think you understand inflation because you can define it, you will not go looking for the mechanism. If you think you understand your medical diagnosis because you can pronounce it, you will not ask the harder questions. If you think you understand political systems because you can name them, you will not demand that anyone actually explain the causality. The name, worn as a badge of understanding, is the enemy of understanding, But the moment you put it down, the moment you say, "Actually, I know what this is called, and I do not yet know what it is," you have done something remarkable. You have created space, a genuine question where before there was only a filled-in blank. And genuine questions are the engine of everything Feynman believed science to be at its best, a method of discovering things that are true about the actual world, not a ceremony of reciting things that sound true about it. That space, that honest uncertainty, is where understanding lives. It is uncomfortable. It is humbling. It is also, if you stay with it, one of the most exciting things a human mind can experience. Feynman described it as seeing a chess game being played when you don't know the rules. You watch carefully. You notice patterns. A piece moves this way consistently. You form a hypothesis. You test it, gradually, not because someone told you the names of the pieces, but because you observed and reasoned. You come to understand the game. And when you do, it is yours in a way that a list of piece names never could be. That is what his father was pointing at in the woods, beside a branch, with a bird that had 1,000 names and a nature no name could capture. What you can do today. The invitation here is not abstract. It is immediate and concrete. Pick something you think you understand, something you feel confident about, something you use the vocabulary of easily and comfortably. Now try the test. Explain it without the technical terms. Trace the mechanism rather than the label. Find the place where your explanation goes soft, where you reach for a word rather than a picture, where you say and then it just kind of does this thing, and wave your hand. That hand wave is gold. That is exactly where the work is. That is the place where a name has been standing in for understanding, sometimes for years. Find it. Sit with it. Go back to the source with this specific question, not "what is this called," but what actually happens and why. You will discover something unexpected. The world beneath the names is more interesting than the names. Every mechanism you uncover leads to another question, another layer, another territory of genuine inquiry. The brown-throated thrush is not just a label, it is a creature that navigates by magnetic fields, that sings to establish territory using a syrinx that produces harmonics no human throat can replicate, that finds its way across hemispheres using star maps and gut bacteria and wind patterns we are still working to understand. The name was a door. The door was always open, and on the other side of it is the actual bird. Feynman once said that the beauty of nature is not only beautiful, it is deeply, subtly strange. That the closer you look, the more astonishing it becomes. That the person who can only name things is standing outside a gallery, reading the titles on the plaques, while the person who asks why, who refuses to stop at the name, gets to walk inside and see the paintings. You have always had access to that gallery. You were just told the plaque was enough. It isn't. It never was. But now you know the difference. And that, unlike a name, is something you actually have.